Hi, this is Ike from Groovy Entertainment. Today we got another record to play for you. Today's record is Daniel Boone. So let's get started.
You ask me what I remember about Daniel Boone as a boy? Well, it won't be hard getting me started, but you may have trouble getting me to stop talking about him. Of all us boys growing up in the Allegheny frontier, Daniel was the one you'd notice first. He was lean and strong even as a youngster, and unusually sure-handed with tools and guns. None of us got much schooling in those days. Remember, I'm talking about way back in the 1740s. But there was still a lot to learn. The littlest children were taught to shoot a gun, and if you missed too often, you got a licking. I don't reckon Daniel ever got licked for missing a shot. He had a real passion for hunting, a passion that was to last him all his life. But shooting wasn't all we had to learn in those days. People lived in log houses then, and before you built your house, you had to clear a place for it in the forest. And Daniel was as handy with an axe as he was with a rifle. We were on the edge of the Indian country, and we never forgot it. We didn't have Indian attacks too often, but once in a while, a stray war party from over the mountain would stage a raid. Even the smallest child was taught to be cautious in the woods. Daniel was always the first to know if an unknown sound was a squirrel, trees rustling, or a hidden savage who might mean danger. Though friendly Indians occasionally visited the settlement, there was always the threat of hostile ones. And these hostile Indians had been known to creep near peaceful communities and kill or carry away children while the kids were out looking for stray cattle.
Do you remember the cabin Daniel built all by himself when he was still just a lad?
I sure do. He used to go out there in the woods and stay alone for weeks. Seemed lonely to some of us, but not Daniel. There was plenty of game, and he'd spend his days hunting deer, bears, squirrels, and grouse.
And wild turkey, too.
They were real good eating.
Sam here knew Daniel after he and his family moved farther south to Yadkin, North Carolina.
I sure did. Daniel was about 15 then. Besides being a fine hunter, he was a good farmer. I was to his wedding, too. Of course, that was some years later. But what a cabin raising that was.
Did you ever see a prettier bride or a happier one? Well, Rebecca Bryan sure got herself a fine man in Daniel Boone. I don't wonder that folks come from miles around for a wedding like this one.
Yeah, lady, just look at that feast. Why, there's beef, pork, fowls, venison, and all kinds.
Wild turkey, bear meat, potatoes, cabbages, and cornbread. No one's gonna go home hungry from this wedding.
Well, all that square dancing sure builds up the appetite.
You gonna stay around, Sam, to help the young folks build their cabin back in the woods?
Yes, sure am. Everybody'll lend a hand. Just like Daniel to want his place to be further back toward the mountain. Just seems like that young fella always wants lots of space around him.
That's the way I remember Daniel, too. He was always a man to need plenty of elbow room. That's probably why some years later, he had John Finley as a guest for a couple of months in his cabin.
Becky, I want you to stay around the fire some tonight with the men to listen to some of John's stories.
Daniel, has he really been to all those places? Beyond the Cumberland Mountains?
Yes, he says it's rich country with wonderful soil and game everywhere. You know how scarce the game is getting around here now. The Yadkin Valley is getting too crowded with settlers for me, Becky. We need more room to breathe.
And I suppose you and the other men wouldn't mind leaving the governor well behind you either.
I don't know why England chooses to appoint such men to administer the colonies. The abuses of the governor and his men are getting too much to bear.
But the danger, Daniel. Unknown country. Savage Indians. Would you really consider leaving this farm and taking me and the children to live in such a wilderness?
Only after I'd seen it for myself, Becky. 5 of us men are talking about forming a party to explore this new land and see how great the risks are, and if it really has possibilities for a settlement. We can hunt and trap, and the pelts will pay us for our time and trouble. The boys are old enough now to do the chores while I'm gone. Come listen to John Finley, Becky. Then make up your mind.
I'll listen to John Finley, Daniel, but I don't need that to make up my mind. You're a good man, Daniel Boone. I know you want only what's best for us, and I trust you.
Thank you, Becky. All a man needs to be happy is a good gun, a good horse, and a good wife.
Oh, Daniel.
I remember when the party left. There was, besides Daniel and Finley, John Stewart, Joseph Holden, James Murray, and William Cool, all fine, courageous men. They started on the 1st of May, 1769, and they were afoot instead of on horseback because the routes were unknown to them. And they took very few provisions, for the wilderness would supply them with food and shelter. It would have been too slow and difficult to cross the mountains, so they followed the westward flowing streams. They were passing through wild and beautiful country that few white men had ever seen. The streams were plentiful, the soil black with richness. Wandering at last along the banks of the Kentucky, they realized they had come upon a settler's dream. They discovered strange mineral springs, where the buffalo and deer came down to lick the salty ground.
I remember Daniel talking later about the game. Said he'd never seen its like before. Buffalo, sometimes hundreds in a drove, and deer in herds. And there were bear, elks, and wild turkeys everywhere. They built themselves a little cabin on the Red River and had a fine time hunting, trapping, and exploring the country.
Maybe Daniel wouldn't have had such a fine time if he'd have guessed it was going to be 2 long years before he was to see his home and family again.
That may be true, but there was no way of knowing. From the time they left, the 1st of May, till near the end of December, they didn't catch sight or sound of an Indian, although the whole region was supposed to belong to the Cherokee and Shawnee. Then, one day when Daniel and John Stewart were hunting in a canebrake near the Kentucky River, a dozen Shawnee warriors sprang on them.
Daniel, they're right on top of us. There isn't even time to fire our rifles. I know Indians, John. There's no escaping getting captured. But we mustn't show fear. Our best chance is to act friendly. Pretend we don't really mind being taken.
You come with us, white men.
Yes, we come with you, mighty warrior.
I remember how smart Daniel always was at figuring out Indians. Funny thing, too. He fought them on and off all his life, but at the same time he could always see their point of view. He didn't hate them, not at all. He treated them fair and square for the most part, at least whenever he could, and they seemed to respect him. Oh, he was an enemy of theirs, all right, most of the time, but a couple of times the tribe even tried to adopt him and make him one of their own. And that's the biggest compliment an Indian can pay a white man.
You're sure right about that. And this was just one time when he was one jump ahead of them because he could think like an Indian and imagine what they were going to do. At first, Daniel and John Stewart had guards every night at the Indian camp. During the long days, John Stewart followed Daniel's advice. He behaved as cheerful and as unafraid as Daniel himself. By the 7th day, the suspicions of the Shawnee were lulled enough for them to do away with the night guards. Then Daniel acted.
John, are you asleep?
No, Daniel. Do you think the right time's come to try to escape?
The fire's almost out. It's dark enough, and everyone's sleeping soundly. We can thank that special feed of roast buffalo meat for that. I think... Wait. Be still. What is it? One of the braves. The one nearest the fire stirred. But I think he's asleep again now. We'll have to make our way out of here by inches. There's sleeping bodies everywhere. And you know as well as I do that just the breaking of a twig could give us away. If they discover us trying to escape, they won't deal with us as kindly as they have up till now. Are you ready?
I'm with you, Daniel. And you know, they not only crept their way out of that camp, not making the slightest sound, but they even regained their rifles.
You'd think that'd be enough trouble for any 2 men, even if they did make good their escape from the Shawnees. But that wasn't all.
Not by a long shot.
You're remembering, too, how it was when they got back to the little cabin.
That was quite a blow. The cabin had been ransacked. All those valuable pelts, 8 months' hard work trapping, were gone. And worse, there was no sign of the other 4 men.
That's right. And no one to this day knows what happened to them. Finley, Holden, Murray, and Cool just vanished without a trace. Maybe Indians got them, killed and carried them off when they stole the pelts. Or maybe they tried to get back to civilization, lost their way, and perished in the wilderness.
That sure was a mystery.
You sure got to hand it to Daniel and John Stewart. They couldn't afford to return to Yadkin Valley empty-handed because they had all gone into debt to make the journey. So instead of being discouraged, Boone and Stewart resolved grimly to start all over again. Pelts weren't good at that time of year, so they concentrated on getting deer skins until they could trap again. Their ammunition was getting low, and they were troubled by the fact that Indians were known to be in the countryside. But still they stuck it out.
And that's how it was when Daniel's younger brother, Squire, came upon them with his companion, Neely.
And what a feat of woodsmanship that was. Imagine two men alone in an uncharted wilderness finding the one pinpoint in an unmapped region of miles and miles where Boone and Stewart were.
I know that Squire Boone returned home with pelts and deerskins to sell several times during the long months ahead, and that Daniel finally came home himself. But whatever happened to Stewart and Neely?
Again, another mystery. Stewart went off one day on a hunting expedition. When he didn't return by nightfall, Boone became alarmed and went in search of him in the forest. It wasn't until 5 years later Boone found some bones in a hollow tree with a powder horn beside them. A powder horn with Stewart's name cut into it. Neely was so frightened by Stewart's unexplained disappearance that he decided to start for home. He was never heard from again.
And if all this weren't bad enough, when Daniel and Squire Boone did head for home, they were ambushed by an Indian war party and robbed of everything. They returned to Yadkin Valley with only the shirts on their backs.
That may be, but Daniel believed the journey had all been worthwhile.
Becky, you wouldn't believe it. I know the past 2 years have been very hard on you, but you'll understand everything when you see this wonderful land of Kentucky.
And you really feel we should settle there, Daniel?
Yes, I do, Becky. And we won't be the only ones to go. Squire and his family are coming with us. There'll be 5 more families joining us further along the mountains, and I'm sure our number will increase. There are a lot of restless, land-hungry men right here in Yadkin Valley. It's going to be a good life in Kentucky, Becky.
But the Boones and some of the other families were to pay a high price for this new life they sought in the promised land of Kentucky.
I was part of that expedition, and I remember well what happened. Everything was planned as carefully as possible. Daniel, our guide and leader, was no man to undertake so large a project lightly. Months were spent in preparation. Still, in those days, this was 3 years before the start of the Revolutionary War, there were so many unknown factors no one could foresee. We had with us everything we'd need to start a permanent settlement. Household utensils, axes, bedding, pack horses, swine, cows, seeds for planting. Everything we'd need, but there was no room for luxuries. We camped one night on the trail to await the arrival of a group of 40 men who were to join us. They were leaving their families behind until the settlement was better established. Boone sent his eldest son, James, who was about 16, to get some flour and farming tools and to tell a part of the joining party where we were. The boy took 2 men and some pack horses with him.
Oh, Daniel. Oh, Jamie, gone forever. We'll never see him again. How did it happen?
Dear, it's no good weeping. We must remember ours isn't the only family tonight who has lost a loved one.
But they were on their way back. So near. Why did they camp for the night when they were only 3 miles away from us? How many were there?
2 from this camp. And Jamie, of course. 6 men from the other side of the mountain. They must have lost their way and not known they were so near us. At daybreak, a Shawnee war party came upon them. Only 2 of the men were able to escape. If it's any consolation, dear, Jamie and the rest must have been killed on the spot. Perhaps without even quite knowing what was happening.
Daniel, I've heard some of the women say their men are talking about turning back. They're frightened now.
If they want to go, they're free to. And God be with them. I think most of the men will elect to stay with us, however. Most of us have already sold our farms. There's nothing to go back to. It's always hard settling a new country. But if we keep our courage, I believe our children and our children's children will thank us for it someday. And we'll always remember, won't we, dear, that Jamie played his part in this big adventure, too.
I'm afraid, though, that Daniel was a bit too optimistic. Quite a few of the men did turn back. And those who went on with the Boone party seem to have lost spirit.
You're right, I fear. Daniel moved his family for the winter into a friend's abandoned cabin on the Clinch River in Tennessee. It was cold and lonely, and they were hungry sometimes, too. And, of course, they mourned the loss of their Jamie.
Daniel's dream of a real settlement in Kentucky was still a long ways off. The Clinch River in Tennessee was as close as they could come for the time being.
And that wasn't the worst of it. The news of the Indians' massacre of James and his party had spread. Settlers and would-be settlers were filled with anger and thoughts of revenge. On the other side of the mountain, the Indians were also talking of vengeance. White men were found killed in their cornfields without warning.
That went both ways, don't forget. Many young braves were senselessly struck down, too.
You're right. And things got worse when 3 stupid, vicious white traders murdered some Indians in cold blood.
And the Indians who were killed had no reason to know they weren't safe. They were being entertained by the traders at the time.
That's what changed Chief Logan, the powerful Mingo leader. The Indians who were killed were relatives of his. Up until then, Chief Logan had been a champion of peace. Now hate filled his heart. He dug up the war hatchet he had just buried, lifted it above his head, and took a solemn oath.
I, Chief Logan, leader of the mighty Mingo, swear that nothing and no one can stop me until I have killed 10 white people for every member of my family so treacherously murdered.
The Mingos weren't the only red men anxious for war with the whites. The Cherokees and Shawnees were carrying war pipes from Indian village to Indian village, painting their faces and bodies, droning chants, doing their traditional dances, and preparing for a bitter fight.
But the colonists were making their own preparations. Every boy and man capable of carrying a gun was called into the militia. Forts were built in frontier valleys. Scouts were sent out to locate Indian forces and report on their activities.
It was during these terrible times of massacre, torture, and desperate escapes that Daniel's fame as an Indian fighter began to spread all over the land. He was appointed a lieutenant, later captain, to lead a group of men in protecting the widely scattered forts and settlements along the border. He was so successful at routing Indian war parties that he is held greatly responsible for driving the Cherokees far down the Tennessee.
Isn't it strange that the man who fought the Cherokee so valiantly and had such a hand in defeating them should only a short time later be sitting with the Cherokee chiefs in a big powwow?
Perhaps not so strange. Although he was a formidable enemy, he often won the respect of his Indian adversaries.
We sit now, O brother, by the council fire. We chiefs and leaders, 1,200 strong, have agreed to listen to what you have to say. It is time now you speak of what you have in your hearts.
As you know, my Indian brothers, I have long planned and dreamed of a settlement of white men in Kentucky. But I have not had the money to buy the necessary provisions and supplies needed to build such a settlement. And then there's the question of the rights to the land. This must be settled. The red man and the white man must live once again in peace together. I brought with me to this powwow Mr. Richard Henderson and some of his colleagues of North Carolina. Mr. Henderson will tell you of the Transylvania Company. He will explain to you what his new company wants to do.
O great Conestoga, little Carpenter, Dragging Canoe, and all you mighty chiefs of the great Cherokee people, my men and I are honored to be among you at this sacred council fire. We know that only one man, a man whom both you and we honor, Daniel Boone, could have arranged such a meeting. We represent a new company, the Transylvania Company, which will make possible opening up your country so settlers may come to farm. We are speaking of peaceful settlers who will bring no harm to your people. We do not seek to take anything away from you unlawfully. We do not propose to operate as some have in the past, taking from the Cherokee what is rightfully his, without payment of any kind. If you will let us have your tribal hunting grounds, we will pay you $50,000 worth of guns, utensils, cloth, clothing, and ornaments. I do not have to tell you that these are materials you need, and you have difficulty finding the money to buy. What we are suggesting is a bargain which will benefit both the white man and the red man, who we hope will live from this day forth as brothers.
The 1,200 chiefs sat in their paint, eagle feathers, and white buffalo robes. There was silence. Then they began to deliberate among themselves. Questions were put to Boone and Henderson from time to time. Then more deliberation. Finally, Little Carpenter and some of the other chiefs persuaded the majority to sign away their hunting grounds, in spite of the anger of Dragging Canoe, who fiercely denounced their action as grievous folly. When all the feasting and ceremony had ended, and the bargain had been agreed upon, Dragging Canoe came up behind Boone and whispered in his ear,
Brother, it is good land we have sold you, but you will find it hard to hold.
When Dragging Canoe warned that a dark cloud hung over the land, he spoke with a prophet's tongue. Few red men listened to him, however, and fewer whites.
I have always believed that Daniel was so wrapped up in his own dream of settling this rich wilderness that he didn't realize what a bad bargain the Indians had made. Daniel was always an honest man, and I'm sure he acted in good faith. But the fact remains that the Cherokees learned when the goods were finally distributed among them that they had been cheated.
Still, it must be said that the treaty was fairly come by as things were handled in those days. The Cherokees knew they had no real title to the country, and they knew that the sale would not prevent their hunting there.
Of course, Richard Henderson didn't see Kentucky in Daniel's terms. Both men wanted it settled. Both men were interested in land. But to Daniel, the new country meant freedom, good hunting, and a few neighbors willing to face peril together. To Henderson and the Transylvania Company, Kentucky meant large profits and the power of having a whole series of settlements under its control. Daniel's was a personal dream. Henderson's almost imperial. They were unlikely partners. Immediately, Henderson put Boone in charge of a party to cut a route through to the new possessions.
And that was the start of the famous Wilderness Road, which was used for many years afterwards by pioneers heading west.
And what a job they did under Daniel's watchful direction. At first, it was merely a path fit only for pack horses. But its grades, the selection of its route through the passes and over the rough country were masterful. Boone took advantage of buffalo roads and Indian trails, connecting them up and cutting through the forests. 2 men were wounded, one of them fatally by a raiding Shawnee war party. Still, they went ahead with determination.
I was with Boone and his party, and I'll never forget the day we came down the beautiful Kentucky River. When we reached Otter Creek, some of the axemen got together and built a few makeshift cabins. We were all tired, but our spirits were high. The country was everything Daniel had promised. Each of us went to lay claim to a piece of property that we'd build on later. And after that, instead of resting like you'd think sensible men would after such a journey, many of us went hunting. We'd never seen such plentiful game in our lives.
Well, I don't mean to criticize, 'cause I wasn't there myself. But I heard tell that Boone was pretty angry with some of you.
He was that, and he had a right to be. Many of the men killed the larger game so wastefully and recklessly that soon a man had to walk 20 miles to find a deer or bear. And that's the meat our lives depended on. And that wasn't all. Daniel knew we might be subject to Indian attack at any time. The Indians had been keeping an eye on us as we came in, and they were getting uneasy. There was no formal declaration of war, but there were a number of small bands of Indians in the vicinity just watching and waiting.
Men, I plead with you once more. We're only a small group, and we must protect ourselves until Henderson arrives with more men and supplies. And we don't know when that'll be. Now, I can understand you're wanting to stake out your piece of ground, and I know many of you are tired. We just want to take it easy, but we can't. Soon our families will begin to pour over the wilderness road to join us. We must start work immediately on a permanent fort in case of Indian attack. All we have worked so hard for will go up in smoke if we leave ourselves defenseless like this. We could be wiped out in minutes. Now, please, are you with me?
I'm with you. I'll go with you.
Good. Now that we've picked the best site for the fort, what we need is a party to lay out the cabins, walls, and corner towers. We want another gang to start planting rows of upright logs side by side. These will be the outer stockade. Now remember, men, there's no time to lose. We must begin at once.
While you pioneers were building your fort in the settlement that was to be known as Boonesboro, a lot was happening the other side of the mountain. It was then 1775, remember? And the American Revolution was approaching at a gallop.
Well, we were playing our part in the development of the country, too, you know. With all our families arriving, you can say we really started the westward movement. And Boonesboro wasn't the only settlement for long. But even the folks in the other settlements knew Daniel, and he knew lots of them. He said their courage was mighty, and their characters as strong as hickory.
Some of them became national heroes, too, like Daniel. You've heard of the famous scout and Indian fighter, Simon Kenton, haven't you?
I sure have. Why, one time when the Shawnees were attacking Boonesboro, they were right fond of doing that. Kenton and Daniel got ambushed. Daniel fell to the ground, his ankle shattered by a bullet. And just when the Indians...
I know that story, too. Just when a warrior was about to tomahawk Daniel, Kenton shot him
and fought off a whole pack of savages. Then he made a dash for the fort, carrying Daniel on his back.
That's the way the story goes, all right.
What do you mean that's the way the story goes? It happened just that way. I know, 'cause I was there. But Daniel wasn't always that lucky, though, when it came to Indians, I mean. I remember that time he was captured by the Shawnee.
He was ambushed, wasn't he? By part of a war party under Chief Blackfish. Funny thing was the Shawnee were on their way to make a surprise attack on Boonesboro.
That sly old fox talked Chief Blackfish into leaving Boonesboro alone until the spring. And what's even more remarkable, he convinced the Indians they ought to spare his life and the lives of his men.
Yes, but in exchange he had to agree that he and the men would go along with them as their prisoners. The men were luckier than Daniel. They were ransomed and free to go back to Boonesboro. But in spite of the large ransom that was offered for Boone, Blackfish insisted Daniel was his personal property and was not for sale. Look lively. Someone's approaching the fort. Can't see too well yet, but it looks like whoever he is, he's alone. Doesn't look like an Indian from here. But we'd best be careful. Could be some kind of trap. We've had plenty of those here at Boonesboro. You know, if we hadn't heard months ago that Daniel Boone was dead, he sure walks like Daniel. But it couldn't be. It is! It is Daniel Boone! Just like he come back again from the dead. Well, I declare. Daniel! Daniel, we've given you up for lost.
Ryan Calloway.
Oh, it's good to see you, Daniel. What happened to you for all these months? We thought we'd never see you again.
I spent these many long months as the adopted son of Chief Blackfish. I finally got my chance to escape and make my way here. There's no time to lose. 500 warriors are preparing to attack Boonesboro. I heard them plan it, and I knew the settlement would be unprepared.
The news of the coming Indian raid roused all us settlers to action. We made ready for an attack. The swift, short Indian attack we were familiar with. But weeks passed and no Indians were seen. We learned later that Daniel's escape had delayed them. When the Indians did finally appear, it wasn't like any Indian attack we had ever seen before. They came openly over the hill, carrying a British flag. The Indians and the British had become allies by this time. One of the braves advanced on the fort, waving a white banner, and asking for Daniel.
Remember, white brother Daniel Boone, we spared your life, and we let you persuade us to cease in our attack on Boonesboro, but only till the spring. It is now spring, and it is your turn to keep your part of the bargain and surrender Boonesboro.
My red brothers do not need to attack Boonesboro. Of what value could it be to them? There are women and children here. Surely my brothers do not want to harm helpless women and children.
It is useless for us to talk further, white brother. Come with us. Chief Blackfish wishes to speak with his adopted son.
Daniel went out alone. The danger was great, but he was playing a desperate game for time. This meeting between Daniel Boone and Blackfish was the first of several conferences during the next anxious hours. In the other powwows, each was joined by some of his men.
What were all of you in the fort doing then? Wouldn't you rather have fought than give in to Blackfish's terms?
Yes, we sure would rather fight, after what we had gone through to build the settlement. While Blackfish promised us if we surrendered we'd be allowed to go in peace to the British headquarters in Detroit, we didn't feel we could trust him. Luckily, the Shawnee didn't know how badly outnumbered we were. At least 6 Indians to every white man.
Now I remember. How was it you were able to fool the Indians into believing there were more of you?
You know what we did? We had all the women in the stockade dress up as men. They kept parading by the open gate right where the Indians could see them. We even dressed some dummies the same way. Of course, the Indians were tricky, too. At one of the powwows, they tried to drag some of our men away as prisoners.
I guess that's when the siege of Boonesboro began in earnest. And I heard tell it was the fiercest and longest of the many sieges known to Kentucky.
Lasted 10 terrible days and nights, from September the 8th to September 17th, 1778. I'm not likely to forget those days. Those Indians attempted to take the fort by every means of warfare known to them. And inside the fort, we fought like people fighting for our lives, our homes, our dreams. We were exhausted, but we couldn't risk sleeping, and our supplies were running low.
I guess one of the worst moments came when the Indians started throwing burning bundles of wood over the walls into the fort.
Fire! Fire! Merciful Lord, there are dozens of blazes, and we're almost out of water. And they got us for sure now. How do we hope to go this fire?
Probably useless, but we still gotta try. We gotta try as long as the water holds out.
We're all over in the kitchen. The whole stockade's aflame. Maybe we ought to surrender. It's better than being burned to death.
It's no use. We've been proved proper this time. We can only pray that those savages don't need to kill us. But it's really too much to hope for.
Look, I think the dust on the road. I'm sure of it. Yes, there's another.
It's raining. It's really raining. Put out the fire. And good Lord has saved us, at least for this night.
Still, the battle raged for a few more days. Then, one morning, there was silence. We couldn't believe it. The Indians had stopped firing. Daniel took a couple of scouts out of the fort. They came back with the report that the Indians had been digging a tunnel that come right in the middle of the fort. But the merciful rain had not only put out the fires, it had softened the ground so much
that the tunnel caved in. And that was too much for the Indians to hear. They quit in disgust during the night. Now it was morning, and there wasn't an Indian to be seen anywhere. Boonesboro had been spared. But soon even Boonesboro became too crowded for Daniel Boone. Always in search of elbow room and new worlds to conquer, he moved his family to a more remote part of Kentucky, and later all the way west to Missouri. Even as an old man, and he lived to be 86, Daniel Boone was still pursuing his dream of expanding frontiers, a dream that nourished him all his life. And that was the great legacy Daniel Boone left to America.
So, that was Daniel Boone. So please like, subscribe, share, and comment. Have a groovy day with another video coming out real soon.